Texas fell 28-14 to Ohio State. And Steve Sarkisian, his fatal flaw pretty much sent Ohio State on a one-way ticket to the national championship. You know, a second and goal, you're trying to tie the game up, and you're at the 1 yard line. And any of us with some common sense probably would have went with a fullback dive, the tush push, because you know the tush push is the most unstoppable play in football. Anytime you call the tush push, to me, I don't know what the science says behind it, but in my calculations, has a 95.67% chance of working out, especially when you're that close in range of being able to score. But instead of going with the tush push, Steve Sarkisian, I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe he thought that they had an advantage on the edge over Ohio State that he thought Texas could exploit it, but he goes for a halfback toss, and it gets blown up. You lose 7 yards. You get put in third and long, fourth and long, and of course they don't convert because you know Quinn Ewers, this dude has no pocket awareness at all. And ultimately, Texas lost this game because of Steve Sarkisian failing to have good play calling in the red zone. The red zone has been a big Achilles heel for Steve Sarkisian, not just as the head coach of the Longhorns, but when he was an offensive coordinator for 1 year in the NFL for the Atlanta Falcons, back to his days when he was the head coach at USC. For some reason, in spite of how good of a play caller Steve Sarkisian is, he just outsmarts himself or outthinks it once he gets inside of the 20-yard line. And I didn't even know coming into this game that Texas was this bad in the red zone. They're 111th in the FBS when it comes to red zone scoring. And there were so many different ways Texas could have punched the ball in. Rather you put in Arch Manning and you run a quarterback power. But to me, not only was that a sign of Steve Sarkisian's fatal flaw coming back to haunt Texas, but it also is a sign that, you know, Texas at their core still is a finesse football team. Steve Sarkisian didn't have enough faith that his big boys up front could generate enough push against Ohio State's defensive line. And when you're trying to score from this close in, you're not going to do it by trying to be finesse. You have to have a sort of power. You got to have a sort of strength up front. And you got to have a different kind of mentality that you're going to say, hey, like, we're not about to try to outthink this thing. We're not about to try to beat them on the edge. We're about to run this football down their throat, up the middle. I don't care if it takes 1, 2, or 3 attempts. We're going to find a way to pound this rock in and tie this game up from the 1 yard line. I just can't believe that decision by Steve Sarkisian to call that play. I know some people don't like to question play calling, but sometimes you have a right to question play calling when you have a situation like this where it's just so blatantly apparent that you have a guy in Steve Sarkisian that just didn't trust his personnel. That's what it looked like to me. And remember, in the semifinals last season, when Texas lost to Washington, when they came back in the game, they lost that same game as well in similar fashion because Steve Sarkisian, his red zone play calling was awful. For some reason, when Texas gets inside of the 20, Steve Sarkisian, he either tries to beat you on the outside with slot fades, or he tries to throw like some 50-50 balls in the red zone, or he wants to beat you on the perimeter. That's not winning football when you get to this area of the field. You have to be able to showcase your dominance up front. I thought Texas had one of the best offensive lines in college football this season. So why was that not demonstrated in this situation on second and goal, 1 yard out? Yeah, Ohio State has a good defensive line, but you have just as many good players on the offensive line as what Ohio State has on the D line. This was one of the worst play calls that we have ever witnessed in the history of college football, because I've never seen a coach squander such a big opportunity to win a game as what we saw in this matchup. Because Steve Sarkisian, you just expect way more out of this brother when you think about how much praise he gets around the landscape of college football for how brilliant of an offensive mind that he is. So the red zone play calling, I don't care how bad Quinn Ewers played. He played better in the second half than what he did in the first half. I put 125% of this loss on Steve Sarkisian, just trying to outthink the room instead of trying to run it up the middle or going with the tush push, which normally always works. He wants to win on the edge, and of course it backfired. When you have a defense as good as Ohio State, I don't even understand what he was thinking with all of the speed and the aggressiveness that Ohio State likes to play with. Once you get into that area and you come out in shotgun and you're that close out, it's pretty apparent what you're about to do, because not a lot of teams are about to run an inside run out of the shotgun when you're 1 yard out. You're either going to pitch it or you're going to run some kind of design quarterback run. So that just was a terrible play call. Sometimes for some of these coaches, the moment can get too big and they think that they have to do a little bit more than what's actually required. And that's how they end up beating themselves and costing their team. After the game, number 16, who plays defense for Texas, he was breaking down the locker room, and I felt really bad for him. I would be frustrated too, because Steve Sarkisian cheated his team out of an opportunity to make it to the national championship. This game was a lot closer than what was initially expected. And the final score doesn't indicate how close this game actually was, but that one play alone just completely changed everything with this game. It just was an awful play call. There's no way you can defend it. Yeah, I know that you know it's a little bit below my pay grade to be trying to criticize somebody's play calling, but that definitely was a moment where if Steve Sarkisian could have ran it back, he would have did things a little bit differently. He tried to justify it in the post-game press conference, saying how, at the end of the day, the players got to execute. Man, that's just BS to me. Because the players got to execute, but as the head coach, it's your responsibility to put your players in the right position to succeed, to win the game, and Steve Sarkisian did a poor job of that, and that's why Texas is now going back home, and that's why Ohio State is playing one last game with an opportunity to win it all.